The air in the arena dressing room was thick with the scent of hairspray, sweat, and cheap cologne. Outside the roar of the crowd was a living, breathing thing, a giant beast, hungry for its king. Elvis Presley, standing before a mirror, adjusted the collar of his rhinestone-studded jumpsuit. His reflection stared back, eyes dark with a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Another show, another city, another wave of adoring fans. His longtime security chief, a burly man named Red West, clapped him on the shoulder. "Almost showtime, EP. You ready to give him hell?" Elvis read, "Always." Red nodded, then gestured towards a new face standing quietly by the door. "Oh, and this here's Frank, Dochi'd addition to the team. Heard good things about him from our Nashville contact." Elvis turned. Frank was a contrast to the usual loud, boisterous men who surrounded him. He was tall but not overly muscled. His dark hair was neatly combed, his uniform crisp. He had quiet eyes, almost shy, and he stood with a stillness that suggested deep observation rather than idleness. He didn't offer a big grin or a boisterous greeting, just a slight, respectful nod. "Mr. Presley," Frank said, his voice surprisingly soft. "It's an honor." Elvis looked him over. He was used to people fawning, but Frank seemed different. "Frank? Well, welcome aboard. Hope you're ready for the roller coaster." Frank gave another small nod. "I've been preparing, sir." Elvis found himself intrigued. Most new guys tried to prove their toughness in. Over the next few weeks, as the tour barreled across the country, Elvis started to notice Frank more and more. Frank wasn't just a shadow. He was efficient. He anticipated needs before they were voiced a stray fan trying to break the perimeter. Frank was there calmly redirecting them without making a scene. A misplaced lyric sheet, Frank would produce it from nowhere. A sudden craving for a peanut butter and banana sandwich at 3 in the morning. Frank was the one who somehow managed to find a store open. He was always there, always watchful, never intrusive. He learned Elvis's habits, his tells, the subtle shifts in his mood. When Elvis was feeling down, Frank would make sure his favorite gospel album was playing softly in the background of the hotel suite. When Elvis was wired after a show, Frank would be the one to quietly suggest a walk in a private garden, away from the chaos. One evening, after a particularly draining show in Vegas, Elvis was unwinding in his suite, playing a quiet game of solitaire. Most of his inner circle had gone out blowing off steam. Only Frank remained sitting at a plush armchair in the corner, ostensibly on guard, but truly just present. "You never go out, Frank?" Elvis asked, not looking up from his cards. Frank paused. "Someone has to stay, and besides, I'm not much for the nightlife, Mr. Presley." "Call me Elvis," he corrected gently. "Everyone else does." "Elvis?" Frank repeated, as if trying the name out. "Right." Elvis looked at him then. "You seem different, Frank. Not like the others. What were you doing before this?" Frank's gaze seemed to drift for a moment. "Just odd job, security work. This is the biggest opportunity I've had." His voice was flat, almost devoid of emotion. Yet Elvis sensed something hidden beneath the surface. A quiet desperation, perhaps. "Oh. Well, you're good at it," Elvis said honestly. "One of the best I've seen." Crossed Frank's face before it settled back into its usual composure. "Thank you, sir. I try." Elvis went back to his cards, but a seed of curiosity had been planted. Frank was an enigma. He was dependable, loyal, and incredibly effective at his job. He seemed to genuinely care about Elvis's well-being, not just his security. Elvis found himself trusting Frank more than he trusted some of the guys who'd been with him for years. There was something about Frank's quiet competence, his unwavering presence, that made Elvis feel secure, truly secure. For the first time in a long time, in a world of flashing lights and screaming fans, Frank was a steady, silent anchor. He was the quiet man in the corner, always watching, always ready. And Elvis, in his often lonely world, found a strange comfort in that. He never suspected that the quiet man held a secret that would shake his world. Couldn't imagine that the trust he was building so carefully would soon be shattered in the most unexpected way. Weeks turned into months, and Frank became an indispensable part of Elvis's entourage. He was a silent sentinel, always present, never intrusive. He seemed to anticipate Elvis's needs before they were even fully formed in the king's mind. A glass of iced tea when Elvis's throat felt scratchy after a long rehearsal, a fresh towel after a particularly energetic performance, quiet reminder about an upcoming appointment when Elvis's mind was still buzzing from the crowd. Elvis often felt like a prize stallion, paraded and shown off constantly on display. His every move was scrutinized, every word analyzed, but with Frank there was a strange sense of normalcy. Frank treated him like a human being, not just Elvis Presley, the king. He didn't gush, he didn't demand attention, he simply did his job with quiet dedication. One hot afternoon in Los Angeles, Elvis was feeling particularly stifled. The air in the mansion was thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and the clatter of dice from a perpetual card game in the den. Crave solitude, a breath of fresh air that didn't come with a crowd attached, Frank, Elvis said, walking into the living room where Frank was meticulously wiping down the antique furniture, an unusual task for a bodyguard, but Frank often found things to do when there was downtime. Could you take me somewhere quiet? Just for a drive? Somewhere I won't be recognized. Frank immediately put down his cloth. Of course, Elvis. Give me 10 minutes to get the car ready. True to his word, 10 minutes later, Frank had a nondescript sedan, waiting, not the usual flashy Cadillac. He'd even swapped his uniform for a plain shirt and trousers. They drove in comfortable silence away from the sprawling mansions and into the winding hills outside the city. Frank found a secluded spot overlooking the sprawling cityscape, a place where only the occasional hiker would stumble upon. Elvis got out, stretched, and just breathed in the clean air. Frank stood a respectful distance away, leaning against the car, scanning the horizon. It's good to just be sometimes, isn't it? Elvis mused, looking out at the tiny buildings shimmering in the haze. Yes, Elvis, it is, Frank replied simply. They stayed there for a long time just watching. Elvis felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't have to be the king here. He was just a man enjoying a sunset, and Frank, the quiet man, was the only witness. Frank, Elvis said, turning back to him as dusk deepened. You ever want to just disappear? Start over. Frank's eyes, usually so composed, held a flicker of something unreadable. Sometimes everyone has a past, Elvis. Sometimes it follows them. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Elvis didn't press. He felt a pang of sympathy. There was a story there, he was sure, beneath Frank's quiet exterior. A hidden pain, perhaps. It made Frank seem even more human, more relatable. A few weeks later, a different kind of crisis unfolded. Elvis's beloved mother, Gladys, had been ill for some time. Elvis was frantic, trying to arrange travel back to Memphis, but the logistics were complicated: security, privacy, keeping it from the press. Colonel, Elvis's manager, was more concerned with canceling tour dates than with Elvis's emotional state, but Frank, without being asked, quietly took charge. He made calls, arranged for a private jet, coordinated with Graceland's staff, and ensured that no paparazzi got wind of the emergency. He packed Elvis's bags, choosing comforting, familiar items. He was a pillar of calm amidst Elvis's swirling anxiety. On the flight, Elvis sat staring out the window, a knot of dread in his stomach. Frank sat across from him, not saying much, but every now and then he'd offer a quiet word of reassurance or a gentle touch on Elvis's arm. She's a strong woman, Elvis. She'll pull through. Even though the words were simple, the sincerity in Frank's voice was a balm. When they arrived in Memphis, Elvis rushed to his mother's bedside. Frank remained at the hospital, setting up a discreet security perimeter, fielding calls, and keeping the chaos at bay. He was tireless, sadly. Gladys passed away a few days later. Elvis was devastated, lost in a haze of grief. Frank, along with Red and the other guys, became Elvis's silent guardians. They handled everything, allowing Elvis to mourn. Frank was the one who made sure Elvis ate, who brought him water, who ensured he had moments of peace away from the intrusive well-wishers. One night, Elvis couldn't sleep. He found Frank sitting in the dimly lit living room at Graceland, watching the silent television. "Frank," Elvis said, his voice raw, "thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Frank looked up, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes were kind. "You don't have to thank me, Elvis. It's my job. But more than that, you're a good man. You deserve loyalty." Elvis sat down heavily on the couch. "Loyalty is a funny thing," he murmured. "Hard to find, harder to keep. Seems like everyone wants a piece of me, but few truly care about me." Frank was silent for a moment. "I care, Elvis. I truly do." Elvis looked at the quiet man, the man who had become his shadow, his protector, his silent confidant. He saw genuine empathy in Frank's eyes. A rare and precious thing in his world, he felt an unspoken bond solidify between them. Elvis had come to trust Frank implicitly, more than almost anyone else in his inner circle. He felt safe with him, truly safe. He didn't know that this unspoken bond, this profound trust, was about to be betrayed in a way that would leave him utterly heartbroken. He couldn't imagine how someone he trusted so deeply could turn out to be the source of his deepest pain. The world spun on a blur of recording sessions, movie sets, and concert halls. Elvis, still reeling from his mother's death, threw himself into his work with a furious energy, trying to outrun his grief. Frank remained his constant. He was the calm in Elvis's storm, the quiet presence that grounded him. But slowly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, tiny cracks began to appear in the perfect veneer of Frank's dedication. At first they were easy to dismiss, minor inconsistencies. Phone call that Frank took outside, speaking in hushed tones, then quickly ending it when someone approached. One afternoon, Elvis was practicing a new song in his private studio at Graceland. He liked to work late when the house was quiet. Frank was always there, usually in the control room, monitoring things. This night, Elvis paused, feeling a verse wasn't quite right. He looked up, expecting to see Frank. But the control room was empty. "Frank," Elvis called out. Silence. He walked over to the door, peered down the hallway. No sign of him. This was unusual. Frank never left his post without telling someone, especially when Elvis was working late. Elvis shrugged it off. Maybe he'd gone to grab a drink, or stepped outside for a moment. He went back to his guitar. A few minutes later, Frank reappeared, looking a little flustered. "Sorry, Elvis, just stepped out for a moment." "Hair. Fine," Elvis said, dismissing it. "Just wondered where you'd gone." Frank nodded, his eyes not quite meeting Elvis's. "Needed some fresh air." Another incident followed a week later. Elvis had a private meeting with his financial advisor, discussing some sensitive investments. He always insisted on absolute privacy for these discussions, usually clearing everyone from the room except for Frank, who would stand by the door. This time, as Elvis spoke about a particularly risky venture, he noticed a faint, almost imperceptible click. He glanced at Frank, who was standing perfectly still, seemingly attentive. Elvis shook his head, blaming it on his tired mind. He'd been sleeping poorly. It was probably just the old house settling. Nothing scandalous, but it referenced a private detail about Elvis's recent investment concerns, the exact ones he'd discussed with his advisor. Elvis was annoyed. How did they get that, he grumbled to Red. I only talked about that with Mr. Jenkins and Frank. Could be anyone, boss, cleaner, staff, even Mr. Jenkins' own office could have a leak. Elvis knew that. His life was a sieve, but it still nagged at him. Frank, of all people. No, impossible. The incidents grew slightly more frequent, and slightly more concerning. A photograph of a rare personal item from Graceland appeared in a fan magazine, an item Elvis rarely let anyone see, kept in a private display case that only a select few had access to. Frank was one of them. Then there was the matter of the fan letters. Elvis received thousands, and while his staff handled most of them, Some particularly heartfelt or unusual ones would be brought directly to him. Lately, a few fans had started restaurant-specific, intimate details about his private life that simply weren't public knowledge. Things he might have only mentioned in passing, perhaps to Frank, during one of their quiet talks. One evening, Elvis was sitting with Red and Joe Esposito, another close friend and aide. He tossed a fan letter onto the coffee table. "Read this. Tell me if you think it's weird." Red picked it up. "Dear Elvis, I know you've been working on a new song about your mama's garden. I hope it brings you peace." Red looked up, puzzled. "Mama's garden? You haven't mentioned that to anyone, have you, EP?" Elvis frowned. "No, not really. I mean, I've been thinking about it. Humming a melody. I might have hummed it quietly in the studio. Maybe mentioned it to Frank once or twice. But it's not like it's public knowledge." Joe leaned forward. "This is getting too specific, Elvis. The financial leak, the photo, now this." Someone is talking. Someone close. A cold dread began to settle in Elvis's stomach. Its mind stubbornly refused to consider. Not the quiet, devoted Frank who had been his rock through the darkest days. It had to be someone else. A new cleaner, a nosy cook, a temporary assistant. Anyone but Frank. But the evidence, thin as it was, kept pointing to the man he had come to trust so deeply. Frank was always there. He had access to everything. He was privy to conversations and moments of vulnerability that no one else was. Elvis started observing Frank more closely. He noticed the subtle shift in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, a slight tremor in his hand when he handed Elvis something. These were tiny tells, easily dismissed as stress or fatigue, but Elvis, attuned to the subtleties of human behavior from years in the spotlight, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He tried to ignore it. He tried to tell himself. He was being paranoid that his grief was making him suspicious, but the unease grew. It felt like a slow, creeping poison, tainting the one relationship that had brought him true solace. He wanted to confront Frank, to ask him directly, but the thought of being wrong, of falsely accusing a man he had come to consider a true friend, filled him with a different kind of dread. And if he was right, if Frank truly was betraying him, the pain of that realization would be unbearable. King, surrounded by a kingdom of adoring fans, felt utterly alone and vulnerable. Wondering who he could truly trust, the whispers grew louder, both in Elvis's inner circle and in the tabloids. The leaks were no longer just minor nuisances. They were strategic. Private meetings about future projects would appear in gossip columns. Days before press releases, details about Elvis's personal health, which he guarded fiercely, started to surface. The media seemed to have an insider's track to his life far beyond what any diligent reporter could dig up. Red and Joe, concerned by Elvis's growing paranoia and the sheer scale of the information being leaked, decided to take matters into their own hands. They were loyal to Elvis, fierce protectors. They started keeping their own quiet watch. "It has to be someone on the inside," EP Red insisted one morning. "Someone who has daily access. We vetted everyone else. Cleaners, cooks, even the pilots. They all check out." Elvis ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed. "But who? Who would do this after all we've done for them?" His gaze drifted to the doorway, where framingly listening to the conversation without engaging. Joe noticed the direction of Elvis's glance. He exchanged a look with Red. The unspoken suspicion hung heavy in the air. "We need to set a trap," Joe said, his voice low. "Something only the mole would know." Elvis hated the idea. Felt manipulative, a betrayal in itself, even to catch a betrayer. But he was desperate. The constant feeling of being watched, of having his private moments exposed, was suffocating him. "What kind of trap?" Red explained. "We feed different pieces of sensitive but ultimately harmless information to different people. Then we see which piece leaks." The idea was solid. Elvis gave a reluctant nod. "All right, but be careful. Don't put anyone in real trouble." They decided on a few pieces of fabricated or exaggerated information. To one trusted aide, they mentioned a secret plan for Elvis to record a gospel album entirely in a hidden cabin in the Smoky Mountains. To another, they spoke of a massive, unannounced donation to a specific, obscure children's charity in Nevada, and, to Frank, Elvis, feeling a pang of guilt, specifically mentioned a highly personal, slightly embellished story about a unique custom-made guitar he supposedly commissioned featuring an engraving of his mother's initials, and how he planned to unveil it at a specific, upcoming private family gathering. "I can't believe this," Elvis murmured to Frank later that day, as if confiding in him. "A guitar like that, it's so personal. I only trust a few people with this information, Frank. It means the world to me." Frank listened, his face impassive, offering comforting words. "Your secrets are safe with me, Elvis. You know that." A knot tightened in Elvis's stomach. It was an elaborate lie, designed to catch a truth. 2 days later, a gossip columnist known for her insider scoops published a piece detailing Elvis's deep personal connection to a custom-made guitar, describing the exact engraving and speculating about its unveiling. The details were too specific, too perfectly aligned with the information Elvis had shared only with Frank. Elvis read the article, his hands trembling. The words blurred on the page, but the message was starkly clear. A cold, hard realization settled in his chest. It was Frank. It had to be. There was no other explanation. He felt a profound sense of loss, a sharp physical pain. It wasn't just the betrayal of a secret. It was the betrayal of trust. The man he had confided in, the man who had been his rock through the grief of losing his mother, the man he had come to consider a true friend, a brother even, was selling him out. Red and Joe entered the room. Their faces grew irrefutable. "Frank," or Elvis said, his voice barely a whisper. A stark contrast to his usual booming presence, he sounded hollowed out. "Get Frank." When Frank arrived, Elvis was sitting heavily in an armchair, the newspaper spread out on the table before him. Red and Joe stood by the door, silent, their expressions unreadable. "You wanted to see me, Elvis?" Frank asked, his voice calm, his posture upright. The very picture of professional competence. Elvis looked up, his eyes searching Frank's face for any sign of remorse, any flicker of guilt. But there was nothing, just that quiet, almost blank expression. "This," Elvis said, pushing the newspaper across the table with a trembling hand. "Read this." Frank picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the article, and for the first time Elvis saw a subtle change. A muscle twitched in Frank's jaw. His shoulders, usually so relaxed, tensed almost imperceptibly, but his face remained a mask. "I don't understand, Elvis," Frank said, his voice still steady though a fraction softer. "What does this have to do with me?" "Don't you?" Elvis's voice was low, dangerous. "That story, Frank. About the guitar, I only told you those details. No one else. I made them up just to see who would talk." He paused, letting the truth hang in the air. "It was a lie, Frank, and you took it and sold it." His eyes, usually so guarded, now held a flicker of something Elvis hadn't seen before. Fear. And then, a deep, crushing despair. He looked like a man trapped, with nowhere left to run. "Frank," or Elvis said again, his voice filled with a heartbreaking blend of accusation and profound hurt. Why would you do this to me? After everything?" Frank dropped the newspaper. His shoulders slumped. He looked up, his eyes finally meeting Elvis's, and in them Elvis saw not greed, not malice, but a desperate, cornered animal. The quiet man was finally unmasked, and the truth was far more complex and far more painful than Elvis could have ever imagined. The king, shattered by this betrayal, braced himself for the confrontation, not knowing that what would come next would be the most shocking part of all the silence in the room, stretched heavy and suffocating. Elvis watched Frank, waiting for an explanation, an apology, anything. Red and Joe remained by the door, their presence a silent accusation. Frank looked from Elvis to the newspaper on the floor, then back to Elvis's face. The composure he'd maintained for months, the quiet professionalism shattered completely. His face contorted, and a raw, guttural sound escaped his throat, a strangled sob. He fell to his knees, not in supplication, but as if his legs could no longer hold him upright. His head bowed and his shoulders shook violently. "Oh, God, Elvis," he choked out, his voice thick with tears. "I am so sorry. I didn't want to. You have to believe me." Elvis stared, taken aback. He had expected anger, denial, maybe even a defiant explanation rooted in greed or resentment. He had not expected this raw, desperate brokenness. "Why, Frank?" Elvis asked, his voice softer now, tinged with a bewildered pain. "Why would you do this? Was it money? Did someone pay you off?" Frank lifted his head, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, money, but not for me, Elvis. Never for me. It was for my sister." Elvis frowned. He knew Frank was a private man, but he'd never mentioned a sister. "Your sister? What about her?" Frank took a ragged breath, trying to compose himself. She's been sick, Elvis, for a long time, a rare, aggressive form of cancer. The doctors, they said there was an experimental treatment, but it's overseas. And it costs more money than I could ever dream of." He swallowed hard, his gaze pleading. "I tried everything, sold everything I owned, took out loans, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough." Elvis's heart, hardened by the betrayal, began to thaw slightly. He was listening, truly listening, for the first time since he'd learned the truth. Then a man approached me," Frank continued, his voice still shaky. "He knew about my sister, knew about my desperation. He offered to pay for her treatment, all of it, in exchange for information. About you." Elvis leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. "He called it an exchange of services. He said it was harmless. Little things at first. Where you went for a walk, what you ate for breakfast, things that would feed the public's hunger. But it escalated, didn't it?" Joe interjected, his voice firm. Frank flinched. "Didn't it?" Joe interjected, his voice firm. Frank was a wreck. He was shaking, his face pale, his eyes red and swollen. He looked utterly defeated. The quiet, stoic man was gone, replaced by a desperate, broken soul. Elvis looked at the man on the floor. Truly looked at him. He saw not a greedy traitor, but a man caught in an impossible bind. A man who had done a terrible thing, yes, but for reasons that were born of love and desperation, not malice. "He promised it would be harmless," Frank whispered again, as if trying to convince himself. "He promised it would just be gossip, but then the phonographs, I knew it was wrong. Every single time I sent something, I hated myself. I wanted to stop. I tried to find another way, but I was trapped. Elvis, truly trapped." "And your sister?" Elvis asked, his voice low. Is she getting the treatment?" Frank of his hand. "Yes, she's responding to it. She's getting better. But I have to keep providing information. He has leverage. He has everything. I couldn't risk her life." The room was silent again, save for Frank's ragged breathing. Elvis felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Anger was there. Yes, for the betrayal, for the privacy invaded. Beneath it, a profound wave of pity and something akin to understanding began to swell. He thought of his own mother, of the desperation he had felt when she was sick. He knew intimately the lengths to which one would go for family. Red and Joe looked at Elvis, waiting for his command. They expected him to call the police, to press charges, to ruin Frank's life, as Frank had tried to ruin his privacy. It was the logical, just reaction. But Elvis was not thinking logically. He was thinking of Frank, huddled on the floor, stripped bare of his defenses, tears streaming down his face. He thought of the quiet man who had stood by him in his grief, who had treated him not as a king, but as a human being. He remembered Frank's quiet words of comfort after his mother died. You deserve loyalty." The irony was crushing, yet it also highlighted the depth of Frank's internal conflict. Elvis closed his eyes for a moment. Taking a deep breath, he opened them and looked at Frank. His gaze was no longer accusatory, but searching, thoughtful. He saw the desperation, the genuine remorse. He saw a man who had made a terrible choice, under duress. And then, something unexpected happened. Elvis the King. The legend felt a stirring of something far beyond anger or revenge. He felt compassion. A radical, shocking compassion that would redefine what it meant to be Elvis Presley. He was about to do something no one, not Red, not Joe, and certainly not Frank, would ever expect the King was about to forgive. Red and Joe watched Elvis, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. They expected a furious roar, a demand for justice, perhaps even a phone call to the police. Instead, Elvis sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the weeping man on the floor. "Get up, Frank," Elvis said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Frank slowly pushed himself to his feet, his body still trembling, avoiding Elvis's eyes. He looked like a man expecting the final blow, prepared for public humiliation and a prison sentence. "So this man," Elvis continued, his voice calm, "he knows everything about you. He has leverage. He knows about your sister." Frank nodded, his voice hoarse. Elvis stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds of Graceland. The sun was setting, casting long shadows. His kingdom, a kingdom Frank had nearly helped to dismantle. "You've been with me for a while, Frank," Elvis said, not turning around. "You saw me at my best and at my worst. You were there when my mama passed. You showed me a different kind of loyalty then, real loyalty." Frank was silent, his head bowed. He couldn't speak. Shame consumed him. Elvis turned back. "I'm not going to lie, Frank. This hurts. It hurts worse than you can imagine. To have my privacy invaded, to have my trust shattered by someone I considered a friend. It's a deep wound." Red and Joe braced themselves, expecting a hammer to fall. This was it, the King's righteous fury. But then Elvis said something that made both Red and Joe gasp, and Frank slowly lifted his head in disbelief. "But I understand," Elvis said, his voice quiet but firm. "I understand what it means to be desperate for family. I understand what it means to be trapped. And I understand that sometimes people do terrible things for reasons that aren't inherently evil." He walked closer to Frank, who flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, Elvis reached out and placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Frank was rigid, Frank?" Elvis asked, his voice low and serious. "The one blackmailing you?" Frank hesitated, then swallowed hard. He calls himself Mr. Blackwood. He operates through cutouts. I don't know his real name or where. He truly lives. He's very careful. So you're still bound to him." Elvis pressed. "Yes, he contacts me, tells me what he wants. If I don't deliver, he threatens my sister." Frank's voice was a whisper. "I'm still supposed to send him something tonight." Elvis took a breath. He looked at Red, then Joe. Their faces were a tableau of shock. "Frank," Elvis said, his hand still on Frank's shoulder, his gaze unwavering, "I'm going to make you an offer. An unthinkable offer, maybe." Frank looked up, his eyes wide with a fragile hope that he didn't dare to believe. "You're going to tell me everything you know about this Mr. Blackwood," Elvis continued. "Every detail, every contact, every method he uses. We're going to stop him, not just for me, but for you, to break you free from his hold." Frank stared. "Stop him? But he's powerful and my sister." "We'll protect your sister," Elvis stated, his voice resolute. "We will ensure she gets the best treatment, without your contributions to this Blackwood character. We will do it discreetly. No one has to know why." Red stepped forward. "Elvis, what are you saying? You're going to help him after what he did?" His voice was incredulous. Elvis turned to Red, his eyes blazing with a quiet conviction. "Yes, Red, because if I throw him to the wolves, If I ruin his life? What does that solve, Frank? He acted out of desperation, not malice. If I can help him escape this man's clutches, then maybe something good can come out of this mess. Maybe he can truly start over. He turned back to Frank. Here's the deal, Frank. We work together. You help us take down this Blackwood in return. I guarantee your sister's care. And after this is all over, shame, a fresh start. But you will never work for me again, Frank. And this secret stays between us forever. Frank was speechless. He was shaking, not from fear now, but from the sheer, overwhelming shock of Elvis's offer. It was completely insane. It was illogical. It was the most compassionate, unselfish, and utterly unexpected reaction he could have ever imagined. Elvis the King was offering him salvation, not damnation. He was offering him a way out and a chance to truly save his sister without sacrificing his soul. Tears welled up in Frank's eyes again, but these were tears of profound relief and gratitude. He dropped to his knees again, this time truly in humble supplication. Elvis, I don't know what to say. I don't deserve this. Maybe not, Elvis said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. But I'm offering it anyway because I believe in second chances, Frank, and because I believe you're not a bad man. Just a man who made a terrible mistake in a desperate situation. Now are you with me? Are you ready to fight back? Frank looked up, his eyes shining with a new resolve. Yes, Elvis, with all my heart. Good. Now tell me everything about Mr. Blackwood, every single thing. The battle to reclaim Elvis's privacy and Frank's life had just begun, and it was being waged not with anger and revenge, but with an unexpected act of compassion from the king. The strategy was set. Elvis, Red Joe, and Frank gathered in the early hours of the morning, long after the rest of the household had gone to bed. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Frank, though still visibly shaken, spoke with a clarity born of desperation and the flickering hope of redemption. He recounted everything he knew about Mr. Blackwood. He described the dead drops, the encrypted messages, the untraceable payments. Blackwood, it turned out, was a master manipulator exploiting people's vulnerabilities for profit. He wasn't just targeting Elvis. Frank had overheard vague mentions of other high-profile individuals Blackwood was extorting. His operation was sophisticated, his reach surprisingly wide. He's never met me face-to-face, Elvis, Frank explained, pointing to a rough sketch he'd drawn of a park bench where he usually left information. Always an intermediary, always through coded messages, but he did make one mistake. Elvis leaned forward. What was that? She thought it was unusual at the time, but didn't think much of it. Elvis's eyes lit up. That's it, Frank. That's the crack in his armor. He has a direct line to someone at that clinic, or perhaps he is someone at that clinic. Red Ever, the strategist, chimed in. We need to get eyes and ears on that clinic in Zurich. Discreetly. No one can know we're onto him. Joe, with his vast network of contacts, nodded. I have a few private investigators. I trust they can operate quietly, overseas. The plan began to form. Elvis would continue his public life as normal, giving no indication that he knew about the leaks. Frank would continue to play along with Blackwood, providing carefully carbureted, non-damaging information that Elvis and his team approved, ensuring Blackwood remained unsuspecting. Meanwhile, Joe's investigators would quietly begin their work in Zurich. Protecting Frank's sister was paramount. Elvis instructed his personal physician, Dr. Nick, to connect with the Zurich clinic. Find out everything she needs, Dr. Nick, Elvis had said, his voice firm. Whatever it costs, whatever expertise she needs, she gets it. And it's all handled confidentially. No press, no public announcement. Just make sure she's taken care of. Dr. Nick, a man of quiet integrity. Understood. He asked no questions about the why, simply nodding and getting to work. Days turned into weeks. Frank, now working for Elvis in a different capacity, no longer as a bodyguard but as a crucial undercover asset, felt a crushing weight slowly lift from his shoulders. He still went through the motions of his duties, but now, instead of dreading Blackwood's calls, he saw them as opportunities to gather more intelligence. He listened more carefully, asked subtle questions, and documented every piece of information, no matter how small, to give to Red and Joe. Elvis, despite the ongoing charade, found a strange sense of purpose in this quiet war. He watched Frank, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, gradually replaced by a quiet determination. He saw the integrity that had been forced underground, slowly resurfacing. This wasn't about revenge. It was about liberation. One evening, Frank brought Elvis a coded message from Blackwood demanding intimate details about Elvis's new love interest. It was a vicious invasion of privacy, dictated a carefully crafted, vague response that would satisfy Blackwood without revealing anything truly damaging. As Frank transcribed the words, he looked up at Elvis. "I can't tell you what this means to me, to have a chance to fix things, to know my sister is safe because of you." Elvis held up a hand. "Don't thank me, Frank. Just help us put this man away. And then help yourself. Build a new life. That's all the thanks I need." The information from Zurich slowly trickled in. Joe's investigators confirmed that the Mr. Blackwood alias was indeed linked to a shadowy figure within the clinic's administration, a man named Marcus Thorne. He had access to patient records and was using them to identify desperate families, then offering solutions in exchange for blackmail. Material on high-profile targets, he was intelligent, meticulous, and ruthless. Details of Thorne's methods, his network of informants, his financial dealings. It was a complex web, but it was being untangled thread by thread. The focus shifted from merely stopping the leaks to exposing and dismantling Thorne's entire operation. This was bigger than Elvis. It was about protecting countless others who might fall victim to such a scheme. Elvis felt a surge of cold fury at Thorne's calculated cruelty, but also a renewed sense of conviction. This wasn't just about Frank's redemption. It was about fighting a quiet battle for justice. Finally, Joe received the call. "We have enough Elvis, and more. Thorne's got multiple accounts, multiple aliases. We've got paper trails recordings he's been operating this blackmail ring for years. We can take him down, but it's going to be big." Elvis nodded, a grim satisfaction settling over him. "Good, let's do it. But remember Joe Frank's involvement and his sister's situation that remains strictly confidential. No one outside this room knows. Understood?" Joe looked at Frank, then back at Elvis, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Understood, Elvis." The king had chosen an unlikely path, not revenge, but strategic, compassionate justice. Quiet war was about to explode into the public eye, but the world would never know the true story behind it, or the extraordinary act of forgiveness that had made it all possible. The surprising outcome of Elvis's betrayal was about to unfold. The operation to expose Marcus Thorne was meticulously planned and executed. It involved multiple law enforcement agencies across different countries, working in strict confidence, coordinated by Joe's private investigators and fueled by the intelligence Frank had provided. Elvis and his inner circle kept a tight lid on their involvement, especially Frank's. One crisp morning, headlines around the world screamed with news that had nothing to do with Elvis's music or movies. "Shadowy medical blackmail ring busted. International operation. Uncovers network exploiting desperate patients." The articles detailed the arrest of Marcus Thorne and several of his accomplices. They exposed his sophisticated scheme of preying on individuals with gravely ill family members, offering them access to cutting-edge treatments in exchange for sensitive information about powerful or famous figures. The reports describe his cold, calculating methods, his untraceable communications, and the vast sums of money he had amassed. Elvis read the papers in his private study, a quiet satisfaction spreading through him. There was no mention of Elvis Presley, no hint that his life had been the primary target for months, or that his bodyguard had been the unwilling informant. The media focused on the broader, more chilling aspects of Thorne's global criminal enterprise. Red and Joe came in, their faces relieved. "It's done, EP." Red said, his voice heavy with finality. Thorne is in custody. They've got him on so many counts, he won't see the light of day for a long, long time. And the others involved? Elvis asked. Most of the key players have been rounded up, Joe confirmed. The network is shattered. And most importantly, all of Thorne's leverage is gone. His files, his contacts, all confiscated. He can't hurt anyone else. Elvis nodded. Good, that's what matters. Frank was in the room too. He listened to the news, his face pale but his eyes shining with a profound relief. The weight, the constant fear he had lived under, was finally gone. He was free. His sister was safe. Frank, Elvis said, turning to him. Your sister's treatment will continue, uninterrupted. We've arranged everything. She'll have the best care available. You don't have to worry about a thing. Tears welled up in Frank's eyes, not the desperate tears of shame from before, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. Elvis, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life. You saved my sister. Elvis stepped forward and placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. You saved yourself, Frank. You chose to fight back. You helped us stop a dangerous man. That's what matters. You found your way back. He looked at Red and Joe. And this stays between us. Understood? Understood, Boss Red said, a grudging respect in his voice. He still didn't fully grasp Elvis's decision to help Frank, but he respected the King's unwavering conviction. Joe simply nodded, a slight smile on his face. He understood. He had witnessed Elvis's incredible act of compassion firsthand. Over the next few days, Frank slowly began to detach from Elvis's inner circle. It was a gradual process, subtle enough not to raise suspicions among the wider staff. Elvis made it seem as though Frank was transitioning to a different role, perhaps in a different city, handling property, management, or other discreet business affairs. This was the agreed-upon cover story. Elvis found a trusted, quiet position for Frank with one of his business associates, in a town far away from the spotlight, a job that utilized Frank's meticulous nature and competence, but put him nowhere near the public eye or sensitive information. It was a chance for Frank to truly start over, earn an honest living, and live a normal life without fear or public scrutiny. On Frank's last day, he met Elvis in a quiet corner of Graceland, away from everyone. I'm leaving tonight, Elvis, Frank said, his voice laced with emotion. My new assignment is all set. Elvis nodded. Good. I wish you all the best, Frank. Truly. Frank looked at him, his gaze. I made a terrible mistake, Elvis. I betrayed your trust in you. You gave me a second chance. You showed me what real strength is. Not power, but compassion. I will never forget it. Elvis offered a small, sad smile. We all make mistakes, Bird. That defines us. You chose to set things right. You chose the harder path, and you succeeded. Frank hesitated, then took a step closer. Anything, Elvis said gently. Elvis, anything. Elvis said gently. Elvis, why didn't you just ruin me? Why did you help? Frank's voice was a whisper. Elvis looked out at the manicured lawns of Graceland, then back at Frank. It's about being human. It's about recognizing pain and choosing to heal it, even if it hurts you in the process. He paused, then added, and maybe, just maybe, I needed to know I could trust someone again. Even after betrayal, to prove to myself that not everyone is out. To take something from me, that some people can still be redeemed. Frank nodded slowly, tears brimming in his eyes. Once more, he finally understood. Elvis wasn't just being merciful. He was reaffirming his own humanity, his own faith in people. Goodbye, Elvis, Frank said, extending a hand. Elvis took it, a firm grip. Goodbye, Frank. And remember, you're free now. Go live your life. Frank nodded, turned, and walked out of Elvis's life as quietly as he had entered it, carrying a secret burden lifted and a debt of gratitude that could never be repaid. Elvis stood there for a long moment, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering melancholy. The immediate crisis was over. The betrayer was gone, and justice had been served, but in a way that defied all expectations, proving the king's extraordinary, unexpected heart. Life returned to a semblance of normal for Elvis Presley, but it was a normal subtly altered. The leaks stopped. The invasive articles referencing private details ceased. Constant feeling of being under surveillance began to recede, replaced by a cautious sense of security. Yet the experience left its mark. Elvis was more guarded, perhaps, but also paradoxically more at peace. He had faced a profound betrayal, and instead of reacting with anger and vengeance, he had chosen compassion. That choice had resonated deep within him. His inner circle, Red and Joe, continued to be baffled by his decision. Yet they had to admit the outcome was undeniable. Blackwood was gone, Frank was gone, and Elvis's life was less chaotic than before. They never spoke of Frank again, honoring Elvis's unspoken demand for absolute secrecy. It was as if Frank had never truly been there, a phantom of the past. But for Elvis, Frank was not a phantom. He was a lingering echo, a reminder of the unexpected depths of human behavior, both good and bad, and of his own capacity for forgiveness. He found himself thinking of Frank at odd moments. When a security detail was being particularly quiet and observant, Elvis would remember Frank's initial dedication. When he heard news of someone else facing public scandal, he would wonder if their story, too, held a hidden, desperate truth beneath the headlines. The financial security for Frank's sister remained in place, discreetly managed through a trust fund established by Elvis's lawyers. Elvis received periodic anonymous updates from Dr. Nick. Frank's sister was making remarkable progress, responding well to treatment. Her prognosis significantly improved. Each update was a quiet confirmation that his choice had been the right one. A life saved, a family healed. The incident also subtly changed Elvis's approach to his staff. He was still the king, demanding and larger than life, but there was a newfound layer of empathy. He encouraged his team to speak up about personal struggles, to seek help if they needed it. Quietly ensure that their families had access to good health care. He began to understand that the people around him were not just cogs in the machine of his fame, but individuals with their own lives, their own silent battles. One evening, Elvis was sitting on the porch at Graceland, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. Red joined him, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. "You've been quiet lately." Elvis took a sip of his tea. "Always thinking, Red. Always." He paused. "You know, sometimes you meet someone who makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself, about the world." Red grunted. "Yeah, I guess so. This business is full of them." "No, I mean truly question," Elvis continued, staring out at the darkness. "Like, what does it mean to be strong? Is it always about hitting back? About winning? About being tough?" Red shrugged. "That's how we always saw it, boss. In this world, you gotta be tough, or they'll eat you alive." "And maybe that's true," Elvis conceded. "But what if there's another kind of strength? One that's quieter, harder?" Red looked at him, intrigued by the philosophical turn. "Like what?" "Like being able to forgive," Elvis said softly. "Even when it hurts like hell, being able to see someone's pain. Even when they're the one who caused yours to help them. Even when they don't deserve it." Red was silent for a moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. He thought afresh. He hadn't understood Elvis's decision then, but listening to him now, he started to grasp the profound personal. "Elvis, that's a tough way to live," EP Red finally said. "Being that open, not everyone would get it." "No," Elvis agreed, a faint smile on his lips. He reflected on the intense loneliness that often came with fame. The king was adored, worshipped even, but rarely understood. He was surrounded by people, yet often felt utterly alone. The betrayal by Frank had paradoxically made him feel less alone in a strange way. It had shown him a depth of human suffering, he hadn't fully considered, and in responding to it with compassion, he had found a new, quiet strength within himself. The public would never know the true story of the bodyguard who betrayed Elvis Presley. They would never know the desperate reason behind it, or the king's truly astonishing reaction. They would only see the headlines about Marcus Thorne's downfall, and continue to adore Elvis Presley, the dazzling mid-act performer. But Elvis himself knew, and acknowledged that quiet, deeply personal truth had transformed him in a way that no chart-topping hit or sold-out concert ever could. He had faced his own darkness and chosen light. He had been hurt and chosen to give, and in doing so he had become an even greater king in his own heart.